What if a single moment could change everything? Emily, a woman in her 50s, thought her life was settled until she saved a stranger from a terrible accident. That man? A CEO with a past he's spent years running from. Their unexpected connection becomes a journey of second chances, proving it's never too late to rebuild, rediscover, and love again. Want more stories that dive deep into life's unexpected twists and emotional breakthroughs? Subscribe now and join a community that believes every chapter, no matter how messy, can lead to something beautiful. Don't miss out. Your next story might be the one that changes everything. In the chaotic seconds after the crash, Emily reacted without a second thought. She was never the kind to overthink in moments that demanded action. Her feet pounded the wet pavement as she reached the mangled car. Inside, Luke lay unconscious, a stranger to her then. His body was still, blood trickling from a cut above his brow. Emily fought the panic rising in her chest. There was no time for that. She yanked the door open with all her might, cutting her hands in the process, and dragged him to safety just as the first responders arrived. Emily's pulse raced, not knowing she'd just pulled a CEO, a man whose name she would only learn years down the road, out of death's grip. When Luke woke in the hospital, disoriented and bruised, the last thing he expected was the face of a stranger. A middle-aged woman, soft-spoken yet commanding a quiet strength, at his bedside. She didn't look like a hero, not in the Hollywood sense. "You're one lucky man," she said, a small smile breaking through. "Next time, you might want to skip the shortcut." Luke, too proud to show gratitude right away, gave a half smirk. He didn't tell her who he was. Not that it mattered. At that moment, he wasn't a CEO. He was just a man trying to breathe again, adjusting to the reality that someone had saved him. The accident didn't just crack the frame of Luke's car, it shattered the armor he'd worn for years. Decisions, meetings, deals, all those things that used to feel urgent faded into the background. While he kept his identity under wraps, Emily's presence lingered with him long after she'd left the hospital. Who was she, this woman in her 50s with no agenda, no expectation, just compassion? Luke could have written a check to express thanks, but something told him this wasn't about money. Something inside him was shifting, and he wasn't sure if he welcomed it or feared it. Weeks passed, and Luke, now physically on the mend, chose to step away from the company he had spent his life building. His board thought it was burnout. But the truth was, the accident had ripped open questions he couldn't ignore. Who was he beyond the role? What did he really want from life now? Emily had saved more than his body that day. She'd awakened something dormant, something Luke was only beginning to grapple with. And though he didn't know it yet, life had a funny way of circling back around when you least expected it. Years slipped by, and life, as it often does, marched on without giving either of them time to look back. Emily had focused on raising her kids, pouring herself into their lives, but now that they'd flown the nest, she was left with a strange quiet and an itch for something new. That's how she found herself sitting in the lobby of a sleek office building, waiting for a job interview, equal parts nervous and excited. She adjusted her blazer, feeling a twinge of doubt, wondering if starting over at her age was a foolish dream. As the door opened, she locked eyes with the interviewer and froze. It was him. Luke. Luke's expression shifted from polite indifference to surprise, then something softer. The memory of the accident hit both of them at once, a flash of cold rain, flashing lights, and Emily's steady hands pulling him to safety. "Emily," he murmured, almost in disbelief. Emily raised an eyebrow, her lips curving into a wry smile. "Well, if this isn't awkward." She said it lightly, but her heart was racing. What were the odds of this? And why didn't he seem at all like the man she remembered from the hospital? Vulnerable, uncertain. Here, he wore the polished armor of someone used to running things, yet there was a flicker of something else beneath the surface, something unfinished. As the interview started, the conversation was less about resumes and more about two people trying to piece together how fate had thrown them back into each other's lives. "So, you're the CEO?" Emily asked, her tone light but with an edge of curiosity. Luke chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, I was laying low back then. Guess I owed myself some time off." There was an honesty in his voice that wasn't typical for interviews, an openness that felt familiar, almost comforting. And for a moment, Emily wasn't sure if she was here for the job or if life was handing her a second chance at something far more significant. By the end of the meeting, both of them were aware that the interview was just a formality. This wasn't about a job, it was about unfinished business. Luke wasn't the same man she had saved, and Emily wasn't the same woman who had rushed to his side without thinking twice. Both were starting over, carrying the weight of past choices, losses, and regrets. And as she stood to leave, Luke stopped her, his voice low but sincere. "I think we've got more to talk about than just work." "If you're open to it, of course." Emily paused, her gaze steady. "I might just take you up on that." With that, they opened a door neither of them had been expecting, and neither knew where it would lead. From the moment Emily stepped into Luke's company, life felt like a balancing act on a wire that stretched between her past and her future. The job came with challenges, new routines, a younger team, and the unspoken pressure to prove she could still keep up. At home, things weren't any easier. Her adult kids, suspicious of her new job, and her growing connection to Luke, weren't shy about voicing their disapproval. "It's weird, Mom," her daughter said one evening, crossing her arms like a judge delivering a verdict. "You're too smart to be, what, some guy's project?" Emily took a breath, biting back a sharp retort. She knew this wasn't just about Luke. It was about her children learning to see her as a woman with dreams and desires, not just their mother. Luke wasn't without his own share of complications. His company was going through a turbulent restructuring, and every board meeting felt like a tug of war between innovation and tradition. Investors wanted the old Luke back, the razor-sharp, relentless CEO who lived for the next big deal. But that man was gone, and Luke wasn't interested in pretending otherwise. Late at night, he'd find himself dialing Emily just to hear her voice. "They don't get it," he'd say with a tired chuckle. "It's like they expect me to be the guy I was 5 years ago." Emily, listening on the other end, knew that feeling all too well. "Welcome to my world," she'd say softly. And in those moments, both found comfort in the fact that someone else understood the weight of trying to rebuild when everyone expects you to stay the same. The time they spent together grew into something more than work lunches and late-night calls. Yet, the closer they got, the more tangled things became. Emily found herself stuck between two lives, one where she was a mother navigating the awkward transition from full-time parent to empty nester, and another where she was a woman trying to figure out if there was room in her heart for someone new. Her kids, protective and a little lost themselves, resisted the idea of her moving on. "It's not about Luke," her son finally admitted one day. "It's just hard to see you with someone who isn't Dad." Emily didn't have a quick response to that. All she could do was remind them, and herself, that love wasn't about replacing anyone. It was about finding space where you thought none existed. Meanwhile, Luke wrestled with his own set of dilemmas. The weight of societal expectations pressed on him from every angle. Friends, colleagues, even distant acquaintances had opinions about how he should move forward. "Why are you slowing down?" one old friend asked over drinks, bewildered. "You're not the kind of guy who takes his foot off the gas." Luke smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. What nobody understood was that he didn't need to be the man he once was. He needed to be the man he was becoming. And Emily, somehow, against all odds, was becoming the person who made him believe that was possible. But finding balance between the demands of work, family, and new love was no small feat. It was a tightrope walk, and they were both hoping they wouldn't fall. The deeper their relationship grew, the more complicated it became. Luke found himself staring at old photographs of his late wife late into the night, a cocktail of guilt and nostalgia swirling inside him. He could almost hear her laugh, feel her presence as though she hadn't left. And yet, here he was, on the verge of loving someone else. It wasn't that he wanted to forget her. He knew he never would. But moving forward felt like betrayal. "It's not supposed to be this hard," he muttered one night, head in his hands, phone in his lap. On the other end, Emily stayed quiet, sensing the weight of his inner struggle. "You don't have to erase her to make room for me," she finally whispered. "You just have to let yourself believe it's okay." Emily wasn't free from her own emotional knots. While her heart pulled her toward Luke, fear whispered warnings in the back of her mind. What if this was too much, too soon? What if her kids never accepted this new chapter in her life? "You can't expect them to understand right away," her friend told her over coffee one morning. "They grew up thinking their parents' love story was the only one. Now they have to adjust to the idea that love can happen more than once." Emily nodded, stirring her drink absent-mindedly, but the truth stung. Deep down, she was terrified that by embracing this new love, she'd be branded selfish or foolish. And yet, Luke's presence felt like home, one she hadn't realized she needed. Tension built between them in small, subtle ways. Luke would pull away at times, lost in the maze of his grief, and Emily, not wanting to push too hard, would step back, but distance only fed the uncertainty. "Do you even want this?" she asked one night, frustration lacing her voice. Luke, caught off guard, struggled to answer. "I want you," he admitted, rubbing his temples. I didn't think loving someone again would be this complicated." Emily exhaled, her gaze softening. "It's only complicated if we make it that way," she said gently. "We don't have to have it all figured out. We just have to keep showing up." Their shared vulnerability became both a burden and a bridge. Luke's grief, Emily's fear, the pressures from their families, it all collided in moments that could either pull them apart or draw them closer. But something about their connection made walking away feel impossible. They weren't just two people finding love. They were two people relearning how to live. And though the road was messy and uncertain, there was a strange comfort in the mess too. Because maybe love wasn't about getting it right the first time. It was about choosing to try again, even when the road ahead looked anything but clear. It was during one of those quiet nights, with a bottle of wine between them, that Luke began to open up in ways he never thought he could. The fire crackled softly in the background as he ran a hand through his hair, eyes distant, like he was trying to pull old memories from the shadows. "I don't really talk about this stuff," he started, voice low, "but you deserve to know." Emily listened, resting her chin on her hand, giving him space to speak without interruption. Luke's childhood had been rough, more survival than childhood. Absent parents, emotional neglect, and the constant feeling that no one had his back. "I got good at being invisible," he said with a hollow laugh. "And when I finally found someone, my wife, I guess I thought that was my one shot at not being alone." The story of his first wife unraveled like pages from a novel he had tried to close, but never could. "She was everything," Luke admitted, his voice catching. "When she died, it felt like the floor disappeared beneath me." He paused, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand, embarrassed by the emotion rising to the surface. Emily reached out, her hand brushing his. "It's okay," she whispered. "You don't have to carry it all alone." Luke looked at her, really looked at her, for what felt like the first time. She wasn't trying to fix him or replace what was lost. She was simply there, steady and real. In turn, Emily shared her own stories, the battles fought in silence that had shaped her into the woman she was. "Raising kids on your own, it's like you're always running a race, but the finish line keeps moving," she said, a sad smile tugging at her lips. She told Luke about the nights she lay awake, wondering if she had done enough, been enough. You spend so many years being strong for everyone else that one day you wake up and realize you've forgotten how to be anything else. Luke listened with the same quiet intensity she had shown him, realizing how much weight she had carried alone, and how much he admired her for it. That night, they didn't try to solve each other's problems. They just sat together, two people with scarred hearts, sharing pieces of their pasts that had once felt too heavy to reveal. It wasn't perfect. There were tears, moments of silence that stretched too long, and emotions too tangled to name. But in that vulnerability, they found something rare, the understanding that neither had to walk their journey alone anymore. And as the night stretched into morning, both knew that whatever came next, they wouldn't be facing it with walls around their hearts, at least not with each other. Luke was learning, slowly but surely, that opening himself to love again wasn't a betrayal. It was a tribute to the life he once had. Emily's patience worked its magic over time, like a steady tide eroding the walls Luke had built around himself. "It's not about forgetting her," Emily said one evening, her voice calm but firm. "It's about honoring what you had by allowing yourself to live fully again." It wasn't the kind of thing that happened overnight, but Luke began to understand that healing meant making space, not just for memories, but for new beginnings. And that was something Emily, with her quiet persistence, had been teaching him from the start. At the same time, Emily found herself in the middle of a personal transformation. For so many years, her life had revolved around being a mother, a role that had defined her completely. But now, as her children built their own lives, she realized she didn't have to choose between being their mother and being a woman with dreams, desires, and ambitions. "I'm allowed to live for me, too," she thought, not with guilt, but with newfound clarity. Luke's presence in her life wasn't a distraction. It was a reminder that she could still grow, still love, and still discover parts of herself she thought were long gone. Together, they discovered that redemption isn't found in grand gestures. It's in the little things. Luke showing up for family dinners, even when the tension with Emily's kids lingered just beneath the surface. Emily offering Luke quiet support during business meetings where his old insecurities resurfaced. "I've got your back," she'd say with a wink before he entered the boardroom. And somehow, that was enough. The business, the family struggles, the social pressures, none of it disappeared. But with each step they took, they learned to navigate life's chaos hand in hand. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, they started to shift their focus outward. Luke's company began supporting mental health initiatives, a cause he connected with deeply. Emily found new meaning in mentoring younger women, helping them navigate the same life transitions she had once faced alone. It wasn't a perfect journey, but it was theirs. They were no longer running from their pasts or holding on too tightly to what had been. Instead, they were building something new, something that honored both where they had come from and where they were going next. The final piece of their journey began with a simple idea. Luke wanted to take Emily to a place he had kept close to his heart, but never shared with anyone else. It was a spot from his youth, tucked away on a quiet hill overlooking the ocean, where the sun painted the sky with colors so vivid it looked unreal. "I used to come here whenever I needed to think," he told her as they climbed the narrow path just before dawn. "It's where I learned that even the darkest night has an ending." Emily glanced at him, her heart swelling with affection. There was something poetic, almost symbolic, about starting a new chapter of their lives, where Luke had once found peace. As they reached the top, the horizon began to shift, deep purples giving way to vibrant oranges and golds. The first rays of sunlight crept over the water, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Emily leaned into Luke's side, feeling his arm slip around her shoulders as the warmth of the morning slowly replaced the night's chill. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. Luke smiled, but it was a different kind of smile, one free from the weight of the past. "Yeah," he said softly, "it really is." And in that quiet moment, Without ceremony or pretense, they both knew. This was the beginning of something entirely new. The sunrise marked more than just the start of another day. It was a promise, an unspoken vow between two people who had learned that life, love, and healing were messy, unpredictable, and always worth the effort. They had carried their grief, their fears, and their doubts up that hill, only to let them dissolve into the dawn. "I think we're going to be okay," Luke murmured, squeezing Emily's hand. She smiled, pressing her forehead gently against his. "Yeah," she whispered. "I think so too." The path ahead wasn't clear, but that was okay. They'd figured out that happiness wasn't about certainty. It was about showing up for each other, day after day, no matter what. As the sun rose higher, casting a golden glow over the landscape, Emily felt something she hadn't in a long time. Gratitude. Not just for Luke, but for everything, every challenge, every loss, every twist in the road that had led her here. Life hadn't turned out the way she expected, but maybe that was the point. "Do you think we'll make it?" she asked playfully, nudging Luke with her shoulder. He laughed, the sound light and free. "With you?" "Yeah, I think we've got a pretty good shot." And with that, they stood together, watching as the world below them woke up, ready to face whatever came next. It wasn't the end of their story, it was just the beginning of a new one. And for the first time in a long time, both of them were ready. Moral of the story: life rarely goes the way we plan, and sometimes the most unexpected moments hold the greatest lessons. Emily and Luke's story reminds us that healing takes time, and love can show up when we least expect it, even after loss and heartbreak. It's never too late to start over, no matter your age or circumstances. What matters is the courage to open your heart again, even when it feels risky, and the willingness to rebuild one step at a time. Now, let me ask you, what would you do if life handed you a second chance? Would you recognize it? Or would fear hold you back? Comment below with your thoughts. We'd love to hear your take. Before you go, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. There's so much more to explore. Stories that inspire, lessons that shift perspectives, and moments that remind us of the power of starting fresh. Don't miss the next video. Your new favorite story could be just a click away.